What would you do if your husband walked into the room with DNA papers in his hand and said nothing at all? That is what happened to me after I joked in front of friends that he might not even be the real father of our children. Now he does not raise his voice, he does not argue, he simply holds the proof, and the silence feels heavier than any fight. My name is Celine March. I am 34 years old, and I need to explain what happened. I work as an administrative assistant in a small office, and I always believed my quick wit was a strength. My husband Adrian, who is 36, works as an accountant and has always been the quiet type. We have 2 children, Nora, who is 10, and Elias, who is 7, both sensitive and watchful. I like to think I brought life into the house, while Adrian brought only silence and seriousness. My mother Iris often told me confidence was better than obedience, and she praised me for being bold. His mother Beatrice hated me for it, calling me reckless and cruel, while his father Leonard stayed mostly quiet. I laughed often at Adrian's expense, telling myself he was strong enough to handle my words without harm. Sometimes I joked too far, especially about Marcus, an old friend who used to flirt with me casually. Adrian's sister Sylvia grew distant, saying nothing, while my brother Damien watched with unease, but rarely confronted me directly. I thought my humor proved strength, but it was really pride, and I refused to admit when it hurt. One night I laughed in front of people and said, maybe Adrian was not even Nora's father. At the time, I thought it was funny, just a careless joke, but the silence after felt dangerous. Now Adrian no longer argues with me, no longer explains anything. He only holds papers in his hand. He stands calm and quiet with DNA results. And that silence feels heavier than any shouting ever could. It began on an ordinary evening that I had carefully dressed up for, even though Adrian barely noticed such details anymore. We were invited to dinner with a small group of friends, and I decided I would keep the room focused on me, because that is what always gave me energy. At home before leaving, Adrian moved quietly through the house, checking Nora's homework and helping Elias with his shoes, while I finished my makeup in the mirror. He barely spoke, and I told myself his silence was weakness, that someone had to fill the space with words. My mother Iris had called earlier, reminding me that men respected women who spoke openly, and she told me I should never let anyone make me smaller. With her voice echoing in my mind, I felt strong and unstoppable as we walked into the restaurant together. At first the meal was light, with everyone sharing stories from work and laughing politely, but I wanted more attention than that. I leaned forward, smiling, and told a story about how Adrian was so serious at home that sometimes I felt like I was married to a wall. A few people laughed nervously, and I saw Adrian's eyes lower toward his glass, but he did not argue. I felt encouraged and decided to push further, because in my mind, silence was proof that I had control. Then, in a tone that I thought sounded playful, I joked that maybe Adrian was not even Nora's real father. The table froze, the air became heavy, and I felt several pairs of eyes shift uncomfortably toward him. For a moment no one spoke, then someone coughed, but Adrian sat perfectly still with his shoulders tense. I laughed louder, insisting it was just a joke, claiming he needed to relax and accept humor as a normal part of marriage. I told everyone that he was too sensitive and too insecure, and that a strong man should be able to laugh with his wife instead of sulking in silence. Some friends smiled weakly, others avoided my eyes, but I believed I had won again, that my boldness made me admirable. Across the table, Sylvia's expression hardened, her lips pressed tight, and I knew she was judging me harshly. Beatrice, who had joined us, whispered furiously that I was shameless, but I ignored her because Iris always told me Beatrice hated strong women. Adrian lifted his eyes at last, meeting mine for just a second, and there was nothing soft in his gaze. The coldness there unsettled me, though I quickly told myself he was only embarrassed and too weak to fight back. Clara, sitting beside me, leaned closer to her father and asked softly why I had said such a thing. The sound of her voice cut deeper than Beatrice's scolding, but I brushed it off and told her not to worry. Adrian stood up after paying the bill, leaving without a word, and for the first time, he did not even glance at me as he walked away. His silence felt louder than shouting, and I knew everyone else noticed it too, because no one at the table spoke for several seconds. I forced a smile, telling them that Adrian always needed space, that he would come around once he understood I was joking. They nodded politely, but doubt hung in the air like smoke, and I hated that it clung to me. Later at home, I called my mother and told her what happened, and she said Adrian was just insecure and too stiff for my kind of humor. She reminded me again that women who speak the truth are often punished by men who cannot handle it, and I believed her words because they protected me from guilt. Yet, as I sat in bed that night, listening to Adrian's steady breathing beside me, I could feel a distance growing. He had not shouted, he had not argued, but his silence pressed harder on me than any words could. For the first time, I wondered if I had gone too far, though I quickly buried that thought beneath my pride. I told myself he would forgive me, because men always forgave women who held families together, and I believed that lie enough to fall asleep. But the coldness in his eyes at dinner stayed in my mind, a warning I refused to take seriously. The morning after that dinner, I walked into the office with my head held high, determined not to look shaken. I told myself that the way everyone had stared at me the night before was only jealousy, because not every woman could joke so freely. My co-workers gathered in the break room as usual, sipping coffee and exchanging stories, and I slipped easily into the center. I told them Adrian had left the restaurant because he was embarrassed and insecure, and I laughed as I said he probably doubted his own children now. A few co-workers chuckled uncomfortably. One asked if I really meant that, but I waved her off. I told them I was loyal enough to stay with him, even though other men still gave me attention. Their faces showed doubt, but I chose to ignore it, pretending their silence meant respect instead of judgment. At lunch, I told the story again to another group, adding more detail to make myself sound powerful. I claimed Adrian sulked at home and avoided me because he could not handle my confidence, and people shifted in their chairs. One man muttered that no husband would tolerate being mocked forever, but I brushed it aside and kept smiling. That evening, Beatrice called me, her voice sharp and cold, saying she had heard enough of my cruelty. She accused me of humiliating Adrian in front of friends and even in front of Nora, who was old enough to understand. I cried into the phone, insisting I only joked because Adrian neglected me, and that humor was my way to survive. Beatrice said my children would grow up ashamed of me if I continued. Then she hung up before I could defend myself further. I sat shaking, then dialed my mother Iris, who immediately told me Beatrice was jealous of my strength. Iris said Adrian's family wanted to silence me because they could not handle a confident woman in their circle. Her reassurance lifted me again, convincing me that my critics were small-minded and that I had done nothing wrong. The next day at work I exaggerated even more, telling people Adrian slept in silence, that he acted like a child sulking in the corner. I claimed I carried the marriage while he dragged it down with his insecurity. Some co-workers laughed nervously, others looked away, but I felt powerful, as if their discomfort was proof of my boldness. At home that evening, I noticed Adrian carrying a pillow into the guest room without a word. He did not look at me, and when I asked if he was angry, he simply closed the door behind him. Nora asked why her father was not sleeping in the same room anymore, and I forced a smile. I told her adults sometimes needed space, and she frowned as if she did not believe me. Elias hummed while playing, unaware of the tension, but Nora's eyes stayed on me, and I hated the weight of her gaze. Later, I called my sister Leah, expecting comfort, but she asked if I thought about the consequences of what I was doing. I snapped back that Adrian would never leave because fathers with children always stayed, no matter what happened. She sighed and said silence often meant storms were building, but I dismissed her and hung up quickly. That night, I sat in bed staring at the closed guest room door, the sound of Adrian's footsteps moving quietly inside. His silence filled the house more than my laughter ever could, but I told myself it was weakness, not strength. I reminded myself again that he could not risk leaving because of the children, because responsibility tied men to families. With that thought, I drifted to sleep, convinced I was still in control, even as doubt crept at the edges. By Friday, I was restless, craving attention that Adrian no longer gave me, so I told him I had to stay late at the office finishing reports. In truth, I drove across town to meet Marcus at a dim bar where music and voices mixed in the air. He greeted me casually, leaning back with that lazy grin he always wore, and I felt a spark of excitement. I told him I felt trapped with Adrian, that silence was smothering me, and I needed reminders that I was still desirable. Marcus listened with half interest, sipping his drink, and joked lightly, but he never matched the intensity I wanted. I leaned closer, telling him Adrian was insecure and controlling, and I insisted that men like Marcus made me feel alive. He shrugged, ordered another round, and smiled, but his eyes wandered elsewhere, and I ignored the sting of his disinterest. When Adrian texted asking what time I would be home, I replied vaguely about paperwork and clients. He called minutes later, and I snapped that he was acting controlling, then hung up quickly before he could say more. I turned back to Marcus, laughing too loudly, declaring that Adrian would never leave because he needed me too much. Marcus flirted lightly, brushing off my serious tone, and I convinced myself his small attention meant more than it did. When he finally stood to leave, saying he had an early start, I forced a smile and pretended it didn't bother me. Driving home, I told myself Adrian was the problem, while Marcus was just cautious, and I replayed excuses in my head. When I walked in, Adrian was at the table with his laptop open, papers neatly stacked beside him. I asked casually what he was working on, but he closed the screen quickly and slid the papers into a folder. His eyes flicked up to mine with steady calm, and I felt a chill I refused to name. Later, I peeked into the folder when he stepped away, and I saw receipts, phone logs, and printed schedules. I told myself he was being paranoid, that he would never dare to act, not with Nora and Elias watching. The next day, Leah visited with coffee, her eyes scanning my face before asking carefully if something was going on. I denied it quickly, saying she sounded just like Beatrice, bitter and judgmental, always trying to trap me in shame. Leah shook her head and said truth always found a way out eventually, no matter how hard people tried to bury it. I rolled my eyes and told her she was jealous of me because I had choices she never would. She left quietly, and the silence in her footsteps felt heavier than words, but I told myself she was weak. That evening at dinner, Nora asked why her father looked sad, her small voice trembling with confusion. I smiled brightly and told her he was only tired, but she kept staring as if she didn't believe me. Elias giggled at his plate, swinging his legs, unaware of the storm between us, but Nora's eyes never left Adrian. He sat quietly, speaking only to the children, avoiding me completely, and that avoidance burned deeper than shouting. Later that night, I called my mother Iris, whispering my fears, and she insisted Adrian was manipulating me with silence. She said men often threatened, but rarely followed through, especially when family was involved, and she told me not to worry. Her reassurance calmed me briefly, but the memory of those folders full of dates and records kept resurfacing. Each day that week, Adrian grew quieter, his movements controlled, his face unreadable, as if he was waiting for the right moment. For the first time, I wondered if his silence was not weakness, but something stronger, something building slowly against me. I told myself he would never risk destroying the family, but the way he watched me said otherwise, and it unsettled me deeply. Sunday dinner at the March parents' house arrived, and I told myself I needed to take control before anyone else twisted the story against me. Beatrice was already moving briskly in the kitchen when we arrived, her jaw tight, her hands slamming pans harder than necessary. Leonard sat quietly in his chair, his eyes steady, watching me carefully as if measuring every word before I even spoke. Adrian carried dishes from the counter to the table, silent and calm, and his stillness made me feel oddly small. Once everyone sat down, I decided to dominate the conversation, so I retold my earlier joke about Adrian not being the real father. I forced a laugh, saying people needed to lighten up, but no one joined me this time, and the silence turned heavy. Beatrice's face reddened instantly, and she slammed her fork onto the table. calling me shameless for humiliating her son in front of family. I began to cry, insisting that Adrian neglected me, and that humor was the only way I knew how to breathe inside a marriage of silence. I said my words might sting, but at least I was honest, unlike people who buried their feelings and pretended everything was fine. Adrian continued eating slowly, never raising his eyes, and his silence struck me harder than Beatrice's fury, because it felt deliberate. Leonard finally spoke, his voice calm but firm, saying respect had already left the marriage and that everyone in the room could see it. Iris, who had called earlier that day, had told me to stay strong and speak boldly, so I clung to her words. I told the table Adrian should be proud that another man admired me, because it only proved my worth and strength. Beatrice snapped that Nora was already ashamed of me, that children did not need a mother who mocked their father like a stranger. My chest tightened, but I forced myself to laugh again, pretending it did not wound me, even though it burned. I looked at Nora and saw her head bent low, her fork scratching circles on her plate as her cheeks flushed red. Elias tapped his spoon loudly against his cup, oblivious, but the atmosphere pressed on him too, and I hated how visible it was. Across the table, Sylvia glared at me with open disgust, while Leah, who usually defended me, sat frozen, her hands twisting in her lap. I slammed my fork down, tears running, and declared that I would not be silenced by bitter relatives trying to crush me. I pushed my chair back and stormed out of the room, waiting in the hallway for Adrian to come after me like he always did. But he stayed seated, calm, his silence screaming louder than my words, his loyalty resting with his family instead of me. I drove home alone that night, muttering under my breath about injustice, repeating Iris's encouragement that strong women were punished for speaking truth. Yet the house felt different when I entered, colder and emptier, as though walls themselves judged me and closed in tighter. I sat on the bed waiting for Adrian to arrive, but the hours dragged past midnight, and he never came home. His side of the bed remained untouched, his pillow still perfectly placed, and his absence felt more final than any fight. For the first time, I realized his silence might not be surrender at all, but preparation, and the thought unsettled me deeply. The week after that dinner began with a sharp knock at the door that made my stomach twist. I opened it expecting a delivery, but instead a stranger in a suit handed me a thick envelope and walked away without speaking. I sat at the kitchen table while my hand shook, pulling out pages filled with legal words I struggled to absorb. Divorce papers, custody filings, financial claims, all neatly arranged, each page a reminder that Adrian had not been idle in his silence. My breath caught as I read his request for primary custody of Nora and Elias, along with financial authority for their welfare. I told myself it was only a bluff, that he was striking out in pride, that no court would ever separate children from their mother. I dialed Iris immediately, crying into the phone, and she told me men often punished women who spoke boldly. She said Adrian was cold and manipulative, and she reminded me that courts always leaned toward mothers. Her voice gave me false comfort, but the papers sat heavy in my lap, impossible to ignore. That evening, Leah stopped by, and I thrust the documents into her hands, demanding to know if she saw how unfair it was. She frowned and admitted that Adrian had a point, that my words and actions had gone too far for too long. Her hesitation hurt more than Marjorie's fury, because Leah had once defended me, but now she looked ashamed. I snapped at her, saying she was betraying her own sister, but inside I felt fear creeping into the edges of my pride. Beatrice called later, her voice sharp with triumph, telling me Adrian had finally found the courage I had mocked him for lacking. She said I would now understand the damage I had caused, and she hung up before I could cry my excuses. Leonard's quiet voice followed in a separate call, calm but steady, saying only that Adrian was protecting his children. The next day, Adrian came by to collect Nora and Elias for dinner, and they ran to him with bright eyes. Nora wrapped her arms around his waist, clinging to him, while Elias grabbed his hand eagerly, and my chest tightened with panic. I tried to argue, telling Adrian he was destroying our family just to protect his fragile pride, but he stayed silent. Instead, he handed me another folder, his movements precise, his expression unreadable, and walked past me to pack bags for the children. When I opened the folder, my breath caught again, because inside were printed screenshots of my private messages with Marcus, conversations I had dismissed as harmless, words I had written to feel alive, now preserved with dates and times like cold evidence. There were lines where I mocked Adrian, lines where I compared him to Marcus, and playful hints that now looked like betrayal. My face burned, but I insisted it was nothing, that Marcus had never mattered, that words were only words. Adrian never argued, never raised his voice. He simply guided the children to the car and left me standing in the doorway. Nora glanced back once, her expression conflicted, but she leaned closer to her father, as if drawn to his calmness. Elias waved cheerfully, unaware of the heaviness, but the sound of their laughter in the car stung worse than silence. After they left, I called a coworker for sympathy, but she told me gently that screenshots looked worse than any explanation. Another colleague reminded me she had warned me that humiliating a husband in public would end badly. Their voices blended into a chorus of judgment, and I slammed the phone down, feeling the world tilt against me. Even Iris's reassurance sounded weaker now, her pauses too long, her voice lacking the certainty it once carried. Leah stopped answering my calls, and Damien sent a message saying Adrian deserved peace, which I refused to believe. That night, Adrian returned briefly to collect more of his things, and I tried to block the doorway with shaking arms. I told him he was breaking our family over his ego, that he was tearing the children away from their mother. He brushed past me calmly, his silence unyielding, and continued packing while Nora and Elias stood close to him. When I begged him to speak, he looked at me once, and in his eyes I saw nothing but resolve. He led the children out of the house, their small hands gripping his, leaving me standing in the doorway alone. The folder of messages remained on the kitchen table, every page a mirror reflecting the consequences of words I thought were harmless. His silence had turned into action, and action meant my laughter no longer had any power at all. The courthouse was colder than I expected, and my legs shook as I sat behind my lawyer with papers piled in front of us. Adrian entered calmly, wearing a plain suit, his shoulders straight, his eyes fixed forward without even glancing at me once. I had imagined he would at least show some anger or relief, but his silence carried more weight than any outburst could. The judge flipped through folders thick with receipts, phone logs, and screenshots, each page neatly organized, each detail carefully documented. My lawyer whispered that the evidence was overwhelming, stronger than anything he had seen in cases like this. I tried to convince myself the judge would listen to me, that jokes were not crimes, that words were not betrayal. But when Adrian's lawyer stood and explained how my public comments humiliated him and unsettled our children, I felt the room closing in. The messages with Marcus were read aloud, not my voice but my words nonetheless, and the courtroom filled with their echo. I wanted to scream that it was nothing, that Marcus never mattered, that I had only been joking and seeking attention. Instead, I sat frozen while the judge asked if I denied them, and I could not speak because denial would have been pointless. The silence that followed felt unbearable, heavier than anything I had carried before, because Adrian still refused to look at me. My mother Iris sat beside me, whispering that men always use the system against women, but her words trembled, as if even she no longer believed them. Behind her, Leah kept her eyes lowered, pale and tense, refusing to defend me, and her silence cut worse than accusations. Beatrice sat proudly, her hands clasped in front of her, while Leonard nodded quietly, as if confirming a decision already made long ago. The judge spoke firmly, saying children needed stability and respect, not ridicule and doubt, and the ruling was swift. Adrian was granted temporary custody of Nora and Elias, financial authority for their welfare, and my access was limited to scheduled visits. My chest burned as I tried to argue that children needed their mother more than his quiet routines, but the judge silenced me. He said the children had already witnessed enough instability, and the court would not allow more damage to their security. Adrian stood calmly, gathered his papers, and left the courtroom with steady steps, his silence louder than my protests. In the hallway, Clara and Elias ran to him, their small hands clinging to his, their faces calm and trusting. I followed, trying to speak, but my voice cracked, and Adrian walked away without answering, guiding them out of the building. Iris muttered angrily beside me, calling it unfair, but even she sounded ashamed, her words thinner than before, her certainty gone. Leah walked past me without a glance, her silence a final judgment that told me I had crossed lines too many times. Beatrice's eyes locked on mine for a moment, filled with relief and vindication, before she turned back to her son. I drove home with my hands shaking, telling myself Adrian would regret it, that children always came back to their mother. I repeated those words like a prayer, but they tasted bitter because I no longer believed them fully. When I reached the house, I slid my key into the lock and twisted, but the door refused to open. I tried again harder, my breath catching, but the lock had been changed, the home no longer mine. Through the window, I saw light glowing softly, shadows moving inside, and I heard Nora and Elias laughing faintly. Their voices blended with Adrian's low tone, calm and steady, the sound of a home carrying on without me. I knocked once, then again, but no one answered, and silence pressed back against me heavier than ever before. I stood frozen on the porch with useless keys in my hand, realizing his silence had not been weakness, but his final victory. Don't forget to hit like, subscribe, and turn on the bell so you don't miss the next story. Write in the comments from which city are you watching.